Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you on behalf of Beacon Our School System to this panel discussion titled Censorship, Endurance, and Crossfire as part of a World of Tomorrow 2021 and beyond towards happier future. This is the 13th edition of the School of Tomorrow event series. And we have an amazing panel for you guys today. The background to why we got this panel together is that we've been seeing these atrocities being committed towards the last 10 days of Ramzan, where the entire world saw a lot of images coming out of Palestine, and there's a lot of information. There are a lot of issues. There's a lot of noise in terms of how the information is flowing out, how a lot of that is being censored, how a lot of that is being converted into different narratives based on political opinions. So we have a very interesting panel here with us today. We have Ahmed Alnaouq, who's the advocacy and outreach chief at the Euromed Human Rights Monitor. He was the inspiration for We Are Not Numbers project, as well as he won the Chevening Scholarship and earned a master's degree in international journalism from Leeds University. We also have Ms. Nighat. She's the director of Digital Rights Foundation. It's a research-based non-profit organization focusing on ICTs to support human rights and digital governance. She's also a development consultant, researcher, professional lawyer, and a member of the Facebook Oversight Board. Our third panelist is Usama Khilji. He's the director at Bolo-B, an advocacy, policy, and research organization focused on digital rights and internet policy, as well as a columnist on Dawn. He regularly talks about free media, about censorship, about digital rights. He is also the board member of the Global Network Initiative, a member of Global Future Council on Systemic Inequalities and Social Cohesion at the World Economic Forum. He is an alumnus of LSE and a Chevening scholar and a TEDx speaker. All panelists, thank you so much for being part of the show.
Thank you so much.
I'll start this discussion off with you, Ahmed. And I want to understand, I mean, this time when we've been seeing what's been going on in Israel and Palestine for well over a decade. I mean, if we go back, it's been happening for the good part of the past 5 decades. But this time when this latest incident happened, somehow there was a new wave of how people responded to it. There was a lot of passion, there was a lot of energy, and we're seeing some very unprecedented steps being taken as well. We're seeing voices coming out in U.S. Congress. We're seeing a lot of international news outlets now beginning to cover these events because of a lot of public pressure. What do you think is different this time around?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I think what's different now is that we have social media and people are starting to use social media so proficiently, different from any time before. And we, the Palestinian people, have been suffering not only this time, not only during the past month, but we've been suffering by the Israeli occupation for more than 73 years. And Israel committed more massacres than this time. Israel displaced 700,000 Palestinians 73 years ago, and then it started its occupation 50 years ago, and then the second intifada and the first intifada, and committed 4 wars against Gaza, and thousands of Palestinians were killed. And the problem that we are having in Palestine is that the international media, the Western media, is complicit in these war crimes that Israel is committing against the Palestinian people. Because if you have seen that all the media, all the UN resolution, the Human Rights Council resolution, they all denounce Israel and accuse Israel of committing war crimes against the Palestinian people. But the international media and the Western media has always sided with the Israel, and that's why all the international public opinion was with Israel and not with the Palestinians. But this time it was different because the Palestinian people and those supporters of Palestine started to use social media. And in Gaza, we call ourselves Gaza Strip has 2 million Palestinians. We call Gaza as a place of 1 million citizen journalists, because now we started to use social media in order and document what's going on daily basis and show the world what's happening. This was different this time. It's not because Israel was more fierce than ever before. It's because we started to use social media more proficiently. But unfortunately, still social media is still censoring the Palestinians, is still covering the Israeli crimes against the Palestinians. But we are trying our best in order to show what's happening in the ground. We're trying to document the Israeli crimes against the Palestinians. And that was what was different, actually. I hope I answered the question.
You did very well. I'd like to take the conversation now to Nighat, and I'd like to understand. We talked about Ahmed talked here about the international media. But then we also hear a lot about how a lot of these new age technology platforms, are complicit in censoring a lot of speech as well. We've heard about a lot of influencers who are pro-Palestine talking about Palestine, their reach getting dropped. Whatever they were, if they were reaching out to 100,000 people, suddenly after talking about Palestine, they were reaching out to, let's say, 20, 25,000, 30,000. And we also saw, in certain videos, whenever someone would say Palestine, it would be captioned as terrorists, and DRT recently covered that as well. And then, thirdly, I think I was reading something in the morning about how images with Palestinian flags were being taken off and being cited as hateful symbols. So what's the context behind these platforms? Also, or rather, my question would be: do you think they're also complicit in censoring this speech coming out of Palestine and in their support?
Thank you, Muzammal, and thanks for having me here. I think it's really important to understand the context in way the platforms have designed their community guidelines and community standards. And I have seen not just in Palestine's case, but several other issues that we have seen globally, for instance, in Myanmar, and how one particular platform was complicit in actually facilitating genocide there. So I think it's really important to see the design of the community guidelines and the products. And I think the biggest question is the automation tools, algorithms, the design behind algorithms, and who are the people designing these algorithms within these companies. I'm at the oversight board of Facebook, and we have so far decided cases where we challenged and actually recommended and asked Facebook to look into their community guidelines and standards. And one of the community guidelines that we are particularly concerned about is actually their dangerous organization and individual policy, under which we have seen a lot of content has been taken down, has been categorized as a terrorist content, not just when it comes to particular country that we are talking about here, but also in other parts of the world. And I think the flaw is in the design, also in the intention, and also the how these platforms and social media companies feel themselves that they are accountable towards Western democracies and not to the rest of the world. So I think there are like so many questions that people have been asking these social media companies, and also questioning and challenging their design, especially I would say that the algorithms that we are talking about, people absolutely have no idea why the content is being taken down, why their stories are not being visible, why one story is being shown on the Instagram and the same story doesn't get permission on the Facebook while they use the same community standard. So I feel that it's very important for these social media platforms to be very transparent when people question them, the way Palestinians and other especially influencers and different media outlets are questioning Facebook, Twitter, and other social media companies at the moment. You are muted, Muzammal.
Thank you, Nighat. Osama, I'd like to take this conversation forward and ask you, Nighat rightfully mentioned, again, the algorithms are very, very important when it comes to mass market content. Obviously, they can't sort of monitor everything. And a lot of times, there is a particular algorithm that's basically cutting out a lot of that content, a lot of that noise for one reason or the other. It could and could not be the fault of the platform. But I think one of the things that I personally found very interesting was a sitting president of the United States getting banned from Twitter, right? And we most recently saw Kangana Ranaut getting banned from Twitter as well. And I think there's a vast majority that agrees with these bans. But then the question for me was, isn't that too much power in the hands of a platform that they can essentially deplatform anybody that they deem not worthy of being there in the first place? And how do we sort of contextualize the future where a lot of people, to be very honest, could just be deplatformed for one reason or the other, and there is no realistic mechanism, not even within the companies, not even within the systems, where you could challenge potentially such actions?
Thank you, Muzammal. A very important question, and thank you to Beacon House School of Tomorrow events for hosting this discussion. Muzammal, I completely, share your concern about companies having way too much power, and I also share this concern about governments having way too much power. Right? So neither companies nor government should have so much authority that within, a second they can silence someone, right? And that's what we're seeing on social media as well. And you rightfully mentioned the cases of Trump and Kangana Ranaut, whose Twitter accounts have been suspended. But I think at the same time, there's also an important need to make platforms safe, and so that platforms are not used for incitement to violence across the world, which we saw these two accounts doing, right? So I think this debate is a very critical one where, on one hand, we have this issue of a lot of incitement to violence and speech that leads to real world consequences for people across the world, especially from accounts from very powerful people like Donald Trump, who is president of the United States, and had a huge following and the ability to influence so many minds within just one tweet. And with Kangana's account, we saw her inciting a lot of violence and post misinformation, and we saw that in Trump's case also. But I also get very uncomfortable thinking that now you do not hear from the ex-president of the United States, who's very hateful, but his account's been completely shut. And so many other people have been silenced also. But we've also seen this power, being wrongfully used by a lot of these platforms. So we've seen a lot of cases in which a lot of activists' accounts have been taken down. A lot of times it happens at the behest of governments that send requests. Just yesterday I was reading statistics about Facebook and Israel, and it was something around 80% compliance rate of content takedown by Facebook upon request from the Israeli government. And this was supposedly, it increased when there was a meeting between Israeli government officials and Facebook officials, right? So we're seeing, on the other hand, the issue that we're seeing and something that we're seeing in India also is this tension between governments and companies in terms of regulation. So, governments are coming up with regulations asking social media companies to censor a lot more content on their requests. And if they don't do so, there's fines, there's, even threats of banning the entire platform. So companies are also under a lot of pressure. But I think at the end of the day, what's of utmost importance is that, we have a baseline of standards of international human rights law that have been agreed upon by all member countries that, discuss these issues, say, at platforms and like the United Nations. But we also see that there's equitable ways of appeal. So, for example, Nighat sits on the Facebook Oversight Board, which hears appeals from users who feel they've been censored or silenced, and then the Oversight Board makes decisions on that. But at the end of the day, you don't have such mechanisms on our platforms. And governments should also, when they're thinking about regulation, they shouldn't really be silencing people or fining people for speech. But if they are to come up with some kind of regulation, they must ensure that there's transparency, and B, there's due process, and C, there's avenues of appeal available for people whose content is being adjudicated upon. And just last thing I wanted to talk about, what Nighat also mentioned and Ahmed also about dangerous organizations, so to speak. And we've seen so many voices from politically disputed territories like Kashmir, like Palestine, really be silenced because the United States decides that some groups that operate within these territories are terrorist groups, and because they're called as terrorist groups, then any content related to them is taken down by the social media companies that are based headquarters in the United States, right? So that's another major issue that we're seeing with platforms that we keep bringing up, saying that you cannot silence people just on the basis of a political tag that's attached by a government that's heavily biased against a certain group of people or community. So I'll stop there, and looking forward to the further discussion that we have.
Great, thank you, Usama. Ahmed, I'd like to ask you, when you talk about censorship, obviously a lot of it is very clear. It's right in front of us. It's like, it's governments with regulations. It's it's platforms with algorithms. But a lot of times it's very subtle. It's very behind the scenes, and something that the Pakistani foreign minister recently talked about on CNN as well. Something that got people really excited on both sides of the aisle. It's basically and again a live proof of that we saw in the form of Mark Ruffalo as well. The actor who plays Hulk in the Marvel universe, and he was actively talking about Palestine. He was aggressively advocating about it, and then eventually a lot of pressure, one way or the other, on him made him retract his original statements, apologize for what he was talking about. And a lot of times what we see is that people are really actually scared of even sort of getting into these sort of polarizing conversations where obviously it's something that really sort of distributes people on both sides. So how do you contextualize that sort of censorship? A lot of again, particularly in the West, it seems like even having a conversation or just to start discussing Palestine is an issue.
Yes, it's increasingly becoming an issue here in the West. When I joined my master's degree in Leeds University, I had so many professors at university who are very, very, very pro-Palestine, who love Palestine so much. But whenever I would ask them to talk about Palestine or to weigh in their insight, they would apologize. Now, unfortunately, there is an Israeli apparatus called Hasbara, which means propaganda in Israel. And every year, Israel would spend millions and millions of dollars in this Hasbara in order to influence the international community about Israel and Palestine. And they would invest millions of dollars in order to make the international media biased to them. One of the tactics that the Hasbara uses is accusing anyone who would support Palestine or criticize Israel of being anti-Semite, and this is actually in the West is a really problem. If someone is accused of being anti-Semite, they would lose their jobs, they would be stigmatized, and they would suffer a lot. So that's why so many people try to avoid criticizing Israel. I have many friends who work in international media outlets in the UK without naming them, and they told me that confidentially that they fear talking about Palestine or criticizing Israel because if they do that, they will be fired from their positions. I have a friend who worked in CNN, and she told me that her boss threatened her that if she does not remove her personal Facebook posts that talk about Palestine, he will have to fire her from the organization. So there's lots of fuss about it. The Israeli media and the Israeli Hasbara is putting so much effort into silencing anyone who would support Palestine, anyone who would criticize Israel, calling them anti-Semite or whatever. So people are intimidated here, but this is not. I think that this is now changing. I think more people now are becoming braver in talking about Israel and criticizing Israel, but still Israel is using all of its power and diplomacy and relations with the West by silencing the Palestinian people.
Nighat, Ahmed talked about propaganda, and I think that's a sort of negative liberty associated sometimes with free speech as well. It's sort of, we're now seeing governments and we're now seeing particularly groups weaponizing, digital media in a way that they're essentially, again, it comes under this, the ambit of dangerous speech. And again, this is a very tricky place to be at, because you deviate a millimeter here and there, and it could have devastating consequences on, the freedom of expression, on freedom as a whole. How are we looking at these sort of negative liberties in the new digital world? Again, the situation is very much evolving. It's great to have these discussions from different sides of the aisle, but also understandably, when someone says, listen, we have to sort of censor some parts of the speech, and again, Usama mentioned that as well, something that could potentially be dangerous or have real world consequences. How do we sort of identify which of that speech falls in these particular ambits? Again, it becomes very, very arbitrary, based on political agendas, based on personal feelings.
Yeah, so Muzammal, I guess it's very important for users to identify what exactly is fake news, what is misinformation, and what is disinformation. So, and at the moment, what we see, especially in global South or developing countries, accessibility to internet and social media is becoming more viable and easier. But at the same time, when it comes to awareness among users, is actually not there. Instead, what we are seeing, which Usama also has mentioned, that instead of raising awareness and information among masses, the governments are more tend to enact regulations and laws and policies, which sort of it's actually an attempt to regulate internet in their particular jurisdictions. But while doing so, what they are doing basically, the arbitrary interpretations of those laws, and we have seen similar situation in Pakistan when it comes to cybercrime law, Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act. So I think it's so regulations are important, but I think it's important and it's the right of the government and states to regulate, to enact laws and policies. But I think the thing that is missing is actually the human rights framework that should be the center of these laws and policies. At the same time, I think it's also important that the social media companies, people should keep holding them accountable, and they should be transparent when they are speaking to the government, when they are speaking to the other stakeholders and powerful bodies. We see them transparent when it comes to US, for instance. We have seen Mark Zuckerberg or other heads of the social media companies, responding to Congress, or even in UK. But when it comes to our governments, we don't even know what kind of negotiations are happening right behind the door. So I think it's very important for users, because users should be the center of these platforms, not the governments, right? So we know that these are difficult times and troubling times, even for social media companies to survive in countries like, for instance, we are seeing what is happening in India in terms of IT rules, social media rules in Pakistan, in Turkey. But at the same time, I think they are responsible to their users, and that should be the main concern of social media companies. Transparency, accountability is something that they really need to focus on. And I think this oversight within themselves is something where we can, they can actually sort of look into this propaganda. Because what we are seeing right now is that when the propaganda happens in other languages and not in English, their algorithms, really do not catch that. And I think that's where, when we mostly focus and talk about context, and that's what I also sort of pursue and push within the oversight board as well.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Usama, Nighat talked about, and I think you talked about that previously as well, regarding government regulations. And I think it seems like, again, because the entire space is becoming so complex, that there is at the very least, there is an understanding that maybe some form of regulation is required. But then the question comes in, there is no real right regulation, best practice that we can look at. And unfortunately, again, what we saw in Turkey and what we saw in India most recently, when some new social media laws are now in full force. There's a lot of talk about maybe they'll be banning Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. We also saw the Delhi police raiding the Twitter office very, very recently. And then again, in terms of how the government was handling their COVID crisis, there's a lot of criticism for that. And, we heard a lot of news reports about how the Indian government actively asked Twitter to take a lot of that criticism down. And so when it comes to these sort of regulations, it's very easy for the governments to say, like, listen, there's a lot of hate speech, there's a lot of propaganda, there's a lot of fifth generation warfare. We have to do this for national security. We have to do this for a lot of different reasons. But then the question mark, again, like Nighat said, why is there no underlying human rights framework to make those regulations? And again, I feel like, and this is a personal opinion, whenever we have a conversation on regulation, it's two very separate camps. One saying no regulation and one saying full regulation. And I think there's not enough conversation or not enough study on what could potentially be the future where we have a safe and responsible usage of internet?
No, thank you, Muzammal. And this is a very important conversation that must be had. I think there are multiple reasons, right? So first of all, there's an acute lack of understanding of how the internet functions as a medium and how social media functions. So because I think it's also linked to a generational gap in about understanding technology in general, and we see that the policymakers that we have in this day and age are those that do not understand technology as well as younger people who developed it and used it more, or digital natives, so to speak, have been using it, right? So there tends to be an approach towards attempting to completely control it without understanding that it's so democratized, and it's so social media it's everyone who's using internet. You cannot make them have licenses, etc., like you do for other media platforms. So I think first issue is the understanding of technology, and then second is linked to that, where there's this acute fear of social media, because I think we have to understand that social media has enabled a lot of accountability of states and of companies, and it's something Ahmed spoke about, at the get-go, where he mentioned that because of social media, now a lot of voices are creating a critical mass on the internet on a lot of issues. Governments are freaking out because of that, because they don't want so many people raising their voice. They don't want to be held accountable. They don't want their corrupt practices exposed. They don't want people to be able to have access to open information regarding the government and the state's functioning, right? And I think for this reason, governments around the world are attempting to control it. Now, what excuses do they use? We've seen the excuses that Israel uses in terms of Palestine, saying, "Oh, it's terrorism," right? And we're protecting our population. So national security really becomes that line of reasoning they use to silence any accountability or any criticism. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind. But having said that, now we come to the third layer, where you have a lot of issues on internet. There are a lot of crimes. There's harassment. There's propaganda. And I think governments and states are very, very active in propaganda on social media, as much as any other group, or I would say even more, because they have so many resources at their disposal, right? So what that ends up doing is like convoluting the conversations and discussions that you have on the internet, and that's where a human rights framework, which your question was about, comes in, right? So what does an ideal human rights framework look like? So before we address that question, I think something that's of utmost importance is that when we talk about regulation, it should be inclusive. And when we talk about inclusive regulation, that all stakeholders that are involved should be consulted before any regulation is made. So this goes in any part of the world where you listen to the people, you listen to the voices, you listen to the experts, and give them a seat at the table, and explain to them that what is the need and what needs to be done, because governments alone are not capable of exercising such a creation of regulation. And B, then you need to look at your constitutional rights that are derived from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So you look at your extent of, okay, what are the lines you're going to draw between freedom of speech and expression and then dangerous speech that leads to incitement to violence, right? And I think that's where it has to be. But what we've seen is that governments have criminalized speech to a very large extent. So we see criminal defamation in Pakistan and in so many other countries, where that is used to silence any accountability. It's used by powerful individuals in cases of, say, sexual harassment that we've seen happen, in Pakistan, the US, and elsewhere. But it's also used by governments to silence people because they feel that the government is being defamed by journalists or commentators and activists. So I think such conversations must be had before we come to decide, okay, what are the lines we're going to draw? And then lastly, I think transparency, like Nighat also underscored, is essential. So what are the companies saying? What are the governments saying? How are they talking to each other? Because at the end of the day, it's our country, it's our words, it's our data, and it's our social media. We make it what it is. So we have to be the most important stakeholders of it. And we should not be, used or weaponized or silenced in any of this process. So I think these are just, some of the few things that need to be taken into account before we move towards a type of regulation that's ideal. And we're grappling with best practices because, Germany came up with this law in which they're giving very small notices. And then the Pakistani government and other governments in, the rest of the world are saying, okay, Germany is doing that, so we can do it too. But not realizing that Germany is not a perfect country, right? Or regulations that they make are not the most human rights friendly. So yeah, I'll stop there. I think I've spoken enough.
Okay, so we're at 30-minute mark. We're gonna be starting. We're gonna begin taking questions from the audience. If you're watching this, if you have any particular question, please share your question with the speaker you want to answer that. And we'll be featuring those in another 15 minutes. Ahmed, I'd like to understand, beyond the context of digital media, even in conventional media, and to be very honest, in any form of communication, a lot of times we see that there is a dehumanization, particularly when we talk about the Palestinian cause. There's the words genocide would never be used. The words, conflict would constantly be recycled. And a lot of these, there's a lot of language that is used to, again, dehumanize Palestinians. Just to make that issue feel like it's something that's going to happen, that's been happening, and want to make the users just sort of disconnect and not get into it more than they should. Why do you think that is something that's happening, and do you think that has a huge impact in how the world sort of approaches the Palestinian issue?
Well, I think we are dealing with an apartheid regime, a racist regime, a colonial regime, a murderous regime. A few months ago, last month, Human Rights Watch issued a report calling Israel an apartheid state. That perpetuate apartheid and persecution against the Palestinian people. Before that, B'Tselem, the leading human rights organization in Israel, accused the Israeli government of being an apartheid and perpetuating persecution against the Palestinian people. So now the Israeli government, the Israeli leaders know that their government and their practices are violate the international law, and they fear very much the truth to be out there in the West and around the world. Because if people knew what Israel is doing against Palestine and how Israel started and what practices Israel is using, they will be in a huge scandal and a problem. So Israel was built on a lie, and it's trying to promote lies all around the world. So anyone who is trying to expose the real face, anyone who's trying to make the world know what's going on, they will be in big trouble. And this is what Israel is doing. They have done it to many activists. I know one of my friends who teaches at Leeds University. Just because she was a Palestinian and pro-Palestine, she was fired from university, and she was never allowed to talk in public because there are Israeli lobbies around the world, especially in the UK and and America, and they are targeting, and they have so many media watches that target everyone who's vocal, who speaks about Palestine and who promotes the Palestinian rights. And this is actually a hypocrisy. We're talking about the West that is promoting itself as a free countries and democratic countries, but if anyone talks about the reality and what's going on in Palestine, they are being chased after.
Right. Nighat, I'd like to understand a little bit about how governments or states are using digital technologies in terms of surveillance technologies, particularly in terms of how they're basically sort of tapping. And again, we're talking about it in a digital age. We're talking about an age where data is the new oil. But then we also know that that data can be weaponized, essentially. Right, and we saw what happened with NSA level surveillance with Edward Snowden and everything that's been going on in the past decade. Do you think this is something that once Edward Snowden sort of exposed that, it's something that the governments are a bit more careful, or do you think it's going to get much worse in the coming days?
I think when we talk about, while we are talking about censorship, I think it's equally important to talk about surveillance regime. There hasn't been much conversation around breach of citizens' data, especially in our part of the world, or talking about surveillance technology, especially when it comes to powerful actors who actually spend millions of dollars and buy such technology to surveil on not just on particular targets, but also on citizens in absence of any data protection law or privacy policy, etc. We have seen that in Pakistan, a lot of money has been spent in last 1 decade, actually. And anyone who tries to talk about this or talk about surveillance regime in general, it becomes a question of national security. And I think that's what Usama also mentioned, that and that's where you can make a connection between censorship and the larger concepts around national security, or different exceptions that are mentioned in our Article 19 of the Constitution. So in the developed countries, we are seeing that a lot has happened after Snowden revelations. Just a couple of days back, one of the groups who work on right to privacy in UK actually challenged UK government in terms of spying on their own citizens after Snowden revelations. And the Human Rights Court in UK basically gave their judgment, which basically said that yes, UK government breached the right of privacy of the UK citizens. But you see, that's the difference between our region and developed world, where people can talk about such violations easily and can even go to the court. Whereas in here, when we talk about such violations or data breaches or privacy violations, or even just asking for a data protection law, people are termed as anti-state. And I think that's the difference that we are seeing here. I think it's really important and important for us to hold government accountable and states accountable, that how much money they are spending in buying surveillance technologies from the Western world. When it comes to NSO, for instance, the Canadian-based company, or even our neighboring countries, now we have much cheaper surveillance technology. But how much money is going into buying that technology? That's the taxpayers' money. No one can ask this question, and if somebody asks that question, they are quickly labeled as oh, you are asking something which actually concerns national security. So I really feel that when we talk about censorship on the internet, we really need to talk about surveillance technologies and the data protection regime as well.
Right, Usama, do you think we can ever really sort of separate these issues when it comes to the context of national security, and alternatively maybe using it as a political tool? I mean, when we sort of, it does make sense for a middle person to think, okay, maybe there's a lot of terrorist activity going on, and that needs to be, the technology needs to be acquired to sort of protect our citizens, to protect our values. But then suddenly, the minute that technology is there, it can be used, and again, in any potential sort of form, and could be used as a political tool as well. So where's that sort of middle ground, or rather, how do you sort of come to a situation where you can use it for national security as it's being claimed, but also have the right sort of checks to not have the citizens rights get avoided because of this?
Yeah, that's a billion-dollar question, right? How do you reconcile the two, the your security and rights? But I think there's a few things that I usually think about when such questions arise, and I think it starts with when you have militant networks and terrorist networks, states should not support them and states should not nurture them. So, we had the United States fund the Mujahideen and the Taliban for decades in Afghanistan and then turned against them, right? And then started calling them terrorists, right? We have that happen in Pakistan with a lot of militant organizations. There are militant organizations, that the state supports, and then all of a sudden turns their back on them, and sometimes pretends to not support them, but, covertly supports them. But I think it's policies like that need to be discussed. Don't all of a sudden say, oh, they're online, so we need to bring in these laws to control the internet because now they're also using the internet. But why are they there in the first place? And what are you doing to stop the kind of activity that they're complicit in? Right. So I think that's the first very important aspect of security concerns, and especially when it comes to terrorism. There's the role of the state. The second important issue is now, of course, yes, there is recruitment, active recruitment going on the internet, and then there's other terrorism related issues that you do face where technologies are used. But it's important not to demonize that technology because it's only a tool and it's not the reason for that kind of activity that is happening, right? So I think that's very important to point out, because oftentimes we say that, oh, this app is used for this thing, hence it's bad. But technology is not good or bad, it's people who use it who are. So I think that's one important aspect of it. But then secondly, I think just the kind of mass surveillance that states are trying to do. So we saw that in term by the United States with the NSA, right? Where they were surveilling on not just American citizens, but citizens across the world. And, by the way, Pakistan was the second most spied upon country by the NSA. But we also have active intelligence agreements between our governments and American governments, right? So I think we also need to demand accountability and transparency around that. So what sort of agreements are happening, and why is citizen data being handed over to foreign agency by our own government and state, affiliated institutions? And I think that's also a major point of concern. But when it comes to then the internet, what we see states often do is use the excuse of terrorism in order to justify further mass surveillance and censorship on the internet. And I think that's why we need to resist it and call out the states for their real intentions and their actions based on what evidenced practices that they usually implement. And I think that's where these laws and these policies that they bring in, right? So, for example, there's been an attempt from these 6 Anglo-Saxon governments like the US, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, the five, they're called the Five Eyes. And what they're trying to do is get companies to get rid of encrypted communication, right? But then the companies are saying that if we get rid of encrypted communication, then everybody's privacy is at stake, because any conversation between two parties can then be read by anyone, and including bad actors and hackers, etc. Right? And similarly, we see governments across the world demand access to private communications and data. So I think that's where we need to draw the line, and I think there's enough that can be done through metadata, but at the end of the day, tackling extremism and terrorism, the solution does not lie on the internet. The solution lies on the ground, and that's where it has to start. Where you can control this is in terms of spreading, when incitement to violence is shared on the internet, and that shouldn't be restricted to certain groups. It should be a matter of principle related to incitement to violence. So it doesn't matter if it's, one political group or a political party or a militant organization or a government or an individual spewing hatred on the internet. It's the issue of incitement to violence that should be key, and that needs to be dismantled, rather than what we see groups like Facebook saying, banning entire groups because they're designated as terrorist groups, and any mention of them or any person who speaks about the same cause even, and oftentimes it's the cause of freedom, like we've seen in terms of in Kashmir or in Palestine, then that should not be silenced at the end of the day.
Right. Taking some pointers from what Usama just said, Ahmed, we saw a lot of Palestinian activists getting banned from Twitter recently. And again, the conversation that was used was, that's incitement to violence. And a lot of times we saw that communication, it had nothing to do with violence, but it's like, you just sort of connect one thing to the other and the other to another thing, and you just sort of make a new context out of it. Is that something, as a matter of fact, I was just looking at Twitter right before this conversation, and I saw a Palestinian activist in the US who talked about a class action lawsuit, against one of these platforms. So do you think there is a legal, course of action to fight back against this sort of censorship that we're seeing on the platform front, or, coming from Facebook or Instagram, banning something as simple as a Palestinian flag?
Well, yes, there are. Well, first, this is a very important question. It's not only Twitter that censors the Palestinians. It's Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and sometimes other media outlets. Like recently, there was when the Palestinians in the last escalation used Instagram to do live streaming and to educate the world about what's going on in Palestine. Instagram targeted these Palestinians, shut down all the pages that we used to live stream, and Twitter, so many people lost their accounts. And Facebook, like Hamla, a Palestinian organization, documented more than 500 confirmed cases in which digital rights of the Palestinians were violated on Facebook. Hundreds of Palestinians lose their Facebook accounts and the Twitter accounts and Instagram accounts. All of that because the Israeli government has some agreements with these major corporations that affects the freedom of expression of the Palestinians. What we should do is that recently, when Instagram shut down the pages of the Palestinians, we made a big fuss about it, and we started to write more and document more of these violations by Instagram. And what happened then is that Instagram apologized for this action and returned these pages that were closed. And it happened also on Twitter with Mariam al-Barghouti, who was a very prominent Palestinian political activist and tweeter. And when we made fuss about it, Twitter apologized and returned her Twitter account. So what we should do is that when some of our rights are violated by this corporation, we should fight for our rights. We should talk more about it. We should educate the world about it, because if eventually this corporation found out that their attack on the Palestinians or on human rights in general, not only about Palestine, they will get fuss about it. They will alter and shift their policies. So I think this is one solution, and the other solution, maybe we should find other platforms. We should create our own platforms. We should never depend on these platforms that violate people's rights and human rights.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Nighat, we also saw a lot of Pakistani platforms. I know a meme page, for example, very successful, very famous in terms of in the Gen Z, who made a post on Palestine, and now the platform is gone. And they've appealed to Facebook. They've talked to them. There is no communication coming back. They virtually are unable to carry forward. They were making a lot of money from it. There was a lot of there's an industry around it, and we're hearing it from a lot of influencers as well, particularly on Instagram. I'm not sure about Facebook, where the reach is getting affected massively. There are people getting shadow banned. People are actually getting banned. Their platforms are getting banned as well. Is there a mechanism for ordinary individuals who are looking at something on the internet, making a judgment based on whether they support them or however, and they choose to use their platforms and in a very responsible way, with no incitement to violence, with no sort of misinformation, and are still getting banned? Is there anything potentially that the government could do, or that the platforms have, where these people can potentially get their platforms back, and again, I would say get justice, because I wouldn't see any harm in what they did, and eventually getting their platforms banned.
Muzammal, I think the rest of the question can be answered by Usama, but I would like to mention that there are certain mechanisms on the platforms when the content is taken down incorrectly by the platforms itself through their algorithms, etc., etc. So users can actually appeal against the decision of the platform, and even if that appeal is they sort of keep their decision the same, then especially when it comes to leave up the content that is left up, or the content that has been taken down under the community standards of Facebook and Instagram, they can appeal to the oversight board as well. And I think I would encourage more people to use such platforms or oversight mechanisms that are available. Unfortunately, it is only available for Instagram and Facebook at the moment, but I really hope that such self-regulatory systems are developed by other social media companies as well. And I'll request Usama to respond to the rest of the question.
Usama, can I just sort of tweak it a little bit for you?
Yes, please. Yes.
What I'd like to understand primarily is, do you think it is the responsibility of the state? And I'm coming at from a creator perspective, and this is something that as creators we talk a lot about. Recently, there was a very famous creator in Pakistan whose YouTube channel got banned, and it took literally a month. And he was sending his brother to school, to university. His entire house was basically being run by that YouTube channel, and it got randomly banned. And it took him almost 2 months and a lot of sort of public support and Twitter hashtags later to actually get that account back. And then we see that same thing happen in terms of getting your accounts verified, in terms of anything that you need from these platforms. Because Nighat mentioned this previously, a lot of these products were made for the Western audiences and then open to the rest of the world. So there aren't any real mechanisms, particularly for countries like Pakistan. It's a huge market. There's a lot of, there are 90 million internet users, but somehow, again, for one reason or the other, we don't have, these platforms, available in Pakistan, where we can sort of communicate with them, where we can engage with them, and we can get our, problems fixed. So on a creator perspective, I know a lot of creators then start demanding it from the government. Listen, you're the government. We voted you in power. Why don't you give us justice? Why don't you get our platforms back? And so on and so forth. How would you contextualize this? What do you think is the right mechanism in terms of policy for something like this?
Muzammal, I wouldn't look towards the government to get their accounts restored, because the government got TikTok banned twice in the last year. So you know how many millions of creators' income was impacted when an entire platform was not available. The government had banned YouTube for 4 years in Pakistan, where creators like yourself were impacted. So if it was up to the government, they would keep banning platforms. And I think, yeah, maybe they would get a few accounts unblocked, but they could potentially get entire platforms banned. So I wouldn't put my hope over there, right? But I think what's important is at the same time for the government to ensure that, yes, there are mechanisms available, that the speech is protected and there aren't arbitrary measures that are in place. So I think it's governments and companies both who have to work at the same time to improve the experience for companies, right? So what we've seen is government sending a lot of requests to social media companies to block social media accounts of people who dissent or criticize government or state policies. Do we want those accounts to be blocked also if we give the state or the government the ability to do so, hypothetically, right? But then at the same time, then creators are also impacted by a lot of policies, such as in the case that you mentioned, right? And that's also something that needs to be dealt with. But I would like to go back to what you also mentioned and Ahmed also mentioned, which is the power of the people. And I'm all about the power of the people because what we've seen with the last few weeks with the issue in Palestine and how Israeli occupation forces have been treating Palestinians, and then how social media companies are seen to be complicit with the oppression. But the people have figured out ways to circumvent that, and people have figured out ways to be unsilenced, right? And I think it's the collective power that's important. So like you mentioned, when a lot of noise was made and people got together, the company then reversed that decision, right? But I think mechanisms like that are available to us outside of when the normal mechanisms don't work. And I would like to go back to say like what happened with Palestine and Israel, right? It's something I wrote about also last week. But what we saw was that Norway's sovereign wealth fund divested from Israel to Israeli companies worth millions of dollars. We saw Ireland pass a resolution saying, okay, this is an apartheid state. We saw dock workers in Italy refuse to load a ship that was sending weapons to Israel. We saw South African dock workers refused to unload a ship that had come from Israel because they were like, this is an apartheid state, and we've experienced what apartheid looks like, right? And then when we saw these social media companies silence people, Facebook's rating on the Play Store went from 4 down to 2 because everyone started giving them 1 star and bad ratings. And that is the power of the people, right? So don't look towards governments or states to fix this, and don't look towards companies like Polite Conversations to fix this. But we have to look towards the power of the people, the power of collective voice. And when we stand in solidarity, whether it's nationally or internationally, that how we can really push change in this world. And I think that's where that power lies. And social media plays a very important role in bringing those people together and building those bridges. So today we're able to have Ahmed here with us discuss Palestine because of the internet and social media, right? We're able to trend hashtags around the world because globally we're trending them together and we're working in solidarity, right? And then worker groups and trade unions are working together through the internet to boycott and Israel, right? So I think just that collective power really works.
Makes a lot of sense, guys. We're at the 9 p.m., 9:11 p.m. Mark, which means 4 minutes left for this conversation. There's another very exciting panel discussion right after this. So I'm going to wrap this up. I just want a final statement from you guys, starting with Ahmed, regarding, the current state of censorship that's happening all across the world, particularly in the context of Palestine and Israel, as that is the most, sort of hot topic right now all over the world. Ahmed, you're on mute right now.
Sorry. So thank you so much. I would like to repeat what Usama just said, that we believe in the power of the people, and the people can make a huge difference. If we are finding some problems with the censorship, with the big corporate, we as people should stand up for these corporations, and we should speak up louder and louder, and we should never be silenced. We should speak more and more, and then everything will be okay, inshallah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ahmed. Nighat, I'd like you to give some final words.
Yeah, I think everything has already been said. What I would like to say that we really need to create counter narrative instead of making more regulations and laws and policies. I think that's very important to counter disinformation, propaganda, and misinformation that we have spoken about.
Thank you, Nighat. Usama?
Yes, I think we just need to push for transparency, for accountability, and for more inclusive policy making when it comes to governments and states. And at the end of the day, connect with people, support each other, because People love freedom all over the world. States love to take away that freedom all over the world. So if we work together, then I think things can really change.
Thank you so much, Usama, and everyone else. This was extremely insightful. I think I think one thing that we all agree on is that there's definitely a lot of power in the power of people, and that's something that we saw recently in the Israel-Palestine. Again, I've been told it's an Israel-Palestine conflict so much I'd repeat that, but it's the genocide that's happening. That's my personal opinion of the Palestinian people, and that's something that's now coming out because of free media, because of social media, because of democratized media. And I think that is the future. The future is democratized media. The future is the citizen journalism that Ahmed spoke about, with 1 million citizen journalists in Gaza alone. Ahmed, thank you so much for being part of the panel discussion. Nighat, Usama, thank you for all the insight on on what's been going on right now all over the world. I hope that we can all pray for and hope for a better world, a free world, a world where we can all have equal rights and have the freedom to live peacefully. Thank you so much to all the audience who was part of the show. Thank you so much for Beacon House for hosting this. This is it for Censorship, Endurance, and Crossfire. See you guys in another panel discussion 15 minutes from now. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.